Hey, I'm Kenneth Ortiz, Director of Online Education here at Bethany Global University. In this video, we're going to be talking about note-taking. It's something that's relatively simple, but if you don't get it right, it is likely that you will not retain as much information from lectures and teachings that you otherwise could have retained. So I want to encourage you to think about how you take notes. Now, some people are naturally really good note takers because their brain just seems to understand note taking intuitively. But for most of us, that's not the case. Certainly not the case for me. So if it doesn't feel natural to you, don't worry, you can still be an effective note taker. There are three methods of note taking that I would like to commend to you. And you can do whichever one you think is best for you. I'd encourage you to try all of them at some point throughout your educational experience. The first method I would commend is the outline method. Now, this is pretty much what is going to come natural to most people. When we say something is the outline method, we're basically just saying it's a generic form of creating an outline. The outline method basically creates points with subpoints. The one very important thing to make sure you do when you are taking notes in this way is to make sure that you use some form of indenting or bullet points. Some people like to use letters, Roman numerals, numbers, whatever. You can do whatever you want, that's fine. Just make sure you have some clear way to distinguish the major points from the subpoints or the sub-subpoints. So if you're listening to a teaching about how to train a dog that has 3 steps. So step 1 would be to love your dog well. Then there would be a subpoint, and here's a subpoint. And then here's some examples of that. You want to just make sure that it's clear when you go back later, when you look at those notes, you know, okay, that was a major point on how to train my dog. Here's another major point. Here's another major point. Here are some subpoints on how to train my dogs. That's in essence the outline method. This is especially a method you could use when you are following along with a lecture that has some sort of PowerPoint or visual aid that also is in outline form. The outline form may work great for you. However, there are 2 things missing from the generic outline form of note-taking that are included in other forms of note-taking. The second prominent means of taking notes is what's frequently known as the Cornell charting system. Apparently, this system was birthed out of Cornell University, but the reality is there are all sorts of charting systems out there for note-taking. In fact, there are whole college courses around charting. Various seminaries and Bible colleges have charting software and charting systems that they use in hermeneutics courses. So there are all sorts of different types of charts that you can utilize in note-taking. And here's the simplest means to utilize a chart in your note-taking system. You want to take a piece of paper or digitally, whatever format you're using, when you're listening to a lecture and taking notes, and you want to create categories. And so sometimes it's main points, then subpoints, then interesting ideas, quotes, right? You want to create columns on your paper that's got different categories. And then as you're listening to the lecture, you are taking notes, and as you hear a piece of information that's interesting to you, you write it down in the column that makes the most sense. But you're going to have a chart, you're going to write something down, and you're going to then use the horizontal rows of the paper. Whether you have lines or not is irrelevant. Just kind of imagine the rows across the paper to then categorize things. So let's say I'm listening to a lecture on the Gospel of John. I may have the different categories. I may have themes, theological motifs. I may have historical elements. I may have key points that relate to a particular type of doctrine. And I'm going to make up all these categories, whatever makes sense to me, and obviously it's going to vary based on the course. And I'm going to just take notes. If I hear something that fits in the theological motif category, I'm going to take notes there. And I'm going to do that, but I'm not going to go straight across. When I hear something, I'm going to kind of go down, kind of almost like a step. But if I hear something in the lecture later on that I think matches, then I want to then go back up and put it alongside something I've already written. So for example, if I hear a lecture on the Gospel of John, and in John chapter 1, verse 1, I'm hearing that the word was with God and the Word was God is speaking about the doctrine of the Trinity, I may put in the theological motif or theological category, I may put there, oh, John 1:1, evidence for the Trinity. Well, then as I continue, I'm going to be taking notes. Let's say later on in John chapter 8, I hear the statement that Jesus says, I am that I am. I go, oh, that's an Old Testament quotation that also is evidence for the Trinity. So I'm going to now create a different category, Old Testament quotations, right? So this is all my different categories. But I'm going to make sure that my quote from John 8 is on the same row, the same line as my John 1:1. Because it relates to that in some way, but it may have been much later in the lecture. So I'm creating a chart where I'm organizing all the bits of information coming my way rather than chronologically on how they come at me during the lecture, the way the outline method does. But in this method, I am now organizing all the information in the lecture by columns in categories, and then I'm using the rows to make sure things match up. And the reality is, at first, when you're doing this, you're going to end up with things very sporadic. But the more you listen to lectures and the more you use the Cornell charting system, eventually what will begin to happen is your brain will begin to make connections that you otherwise would not have made. You'll begin to realize, oh, I'm hearing something. I've already taken notes in a different category that's related to this. And you begin to now go up and you begin to fill in. And by the end of the lecture, you end up with kind of a large chart with different boxes or different sections filled in. In fact, I have seen some people literally draw lines on paper because it's easier for them to keep the rows and the columns organized. This may sound a little bit convoluted to some people, but it really is an effective way to visually see all the pieces of information that have stuck out to you. And now they are categorized. You don't have to go back and systematize or organize all the pieces of information. They've already been organized by you on the fly, making them far more easier to reference, catalog, and index later when you're needing them. This is especially helpful for any course you are taking where you're going to need to write a major research paper. And if you've got those notes, you can go back and look through all the categories in your notes, and you can quickly pull things out. So if I'm writing a paper later on, let's say on the doctrine of the Trinity, I can go back to that John lecture and look at theological motifs and see that, oh, I put Trinity there, and look at all of the pieces of evidence in other categories that relate to this. Look, I've got an Old Testament quote. I've got this other piece of information from my lecture about the Trinity. Wow, imagine that. I've already got references and fodder for my research paper. That's the Cornell method of note-taking. The third form of note-taking that you might want to utilize is what we would call mapping. Now, if I'm honest, this is not something I like to do. It doesn't really fit in my style. But there are certain people that really love this style of note-taking, especially if you're someone that would call yourself, let's say, artsy. If you're more of an artistic type of personality, you are likely to really get a lot out of mapping. Here's how mapping works. You take a piece of paper, and as the lecture is going on, whatever the major point of the lecture is, in the early parts of the lecture or the sermon or the teaching, you write that down. And then what you begin to do is you literally draw lines out from that, and you just write things that sort of stand out to you. So if you're listening to a lecture on the prophecies in the book of Isaiah, I'm going to put, okay, prophecies Isaiah. And then I hear a prophecy about how the Messiah is going to die. Ooh, the Messiah is going to die. I'm going to write that down. And then a prophecy about how the Messiah is going to be king. Okay, Messiah will be king. Oh, Messiah is going to be this and this. So now I end up with a bunch of kind of, lines out from the main point. But then as the lecture continues, I may end up hearing subpoints that I think connect, oh, you know what? The lecturer just said this thing. That kind of reminds me of this over here. Let me draw a line to this. And so you end up with sort of that kind of spider web effect, where you end up with a piece of paper, one main point with lines coming out, and then each subpoint has lines coming out and lines coming out. And if you're an artistic person, this actually visually makes a lot of sense. It would be valuable to have multiple pieces of paper when you're using this particular type of system. I had actually never seen this done effectively until relatively recently. I had a student in class using this type of system. I asked her, where did you learn this? She said, I didn't learn it anywhere. This just makes sense to me. Turns out she is an artist. She's really good at painting and drawing. And the idea of using kind of spider webbing pieces of paper, drawing spider webs out and lines really made sense to her. And like the Cornell charting system, it kind of categorizes things. I don't think it's as efficient or as organized, but many people would disagree with me. They think this is a brilliant way of note-taking, and they're able to go back. Again, if you have to write a major research paper or do a major project, they can go back, look at that and go, okay, I saw this concept pointed to this, and this pointed to this, and this pointed to this, and then begin to then draw other lines. Oh, this points to this thing over here, and this thing points to this. So you end up with lines kind of going everywhere, which, if I'm honest, overwhelms me a tad bit. But for some people, it really helps them to connect the dots between different concepts, and it makes it easy for them to go back later, reference, catalog, and index those things when needed for a major research paper or a major project of any sort. So those are the 3 ways that I would commend you take notes throughout your educational experience: the generic outline method, the charting method, also known as the Cornell charting method, or the artistic mapping method. That's what I call it. The last thing I want to say is taking notes is really important. The reality is, even if you never go back and look at your notes, the statistics show us overwhelmingly that if you are taking notes during a lecture, you are far more likely to remember the information. There are different studies that give different percentages. Some studies say you're 30% more likely to retain the information. Some say you're 50%. One study I saw says that you are 210% more likely to retain information during a lecture or from a lecture if you are taking notes during that lecture. Again, there are a wide range of surveys on the precise results and benefits of taking notes. However, while there is disagreement, here's what we all 100% agree on. Taking notes is an effective means to helping you remain engaged during the lecture and helping you remember. The exercise and practice of writing things down, writing down what you're hearing, real time while you're hearing it, makes it far more likely that you will not get bored, not daydream, and far more likely that you will actually remember the information at some point down the road. Again, even if you never go back and reference the notes, the sheer fact that you were taking notes is helpful during the process of listening and learning from a lecture, teaching, or sermon. So I would exhort you, take notes in whatever format you want to, whether you use one of these methods, a hybrid of these methods, or if you come up with a completely different system on your own, that's perfectly fine. There is great power in taking notes during your educational career, here and elsewhere.